días y buenas tardes en aquellos lugares de la región y del mundo donde ya hemos pasado el meridiano. Saludos desde Santiago de Chile. Sean muy bienvenidos a esta conferencia de prensa donde se presentará el informe anual de nuestra Comisión Económica para América Latina y el Caribe, Perspectivas del Comercio Internacional de América Latina y el Caribe 2025, el comercio internacional en la nueva era de interdependencia instrumentalizada. Esta presentación se está realizando de manera virtual desde Santiago y transmitiendo a través de varias plataformas de Webex, del sitio live.cepal.org, nuestro canal de YouTube, también el sitio web de la CEPAL, www.cepal.org, y nuestras cuentas en redes sociales X y Facebook. Saludamos a todas las personas presentes acá en la sala Raúl Previch de la sede central de la CEPAL, en especial a las y los periodistas que se han registrado para participar en este lanzamiento, ya sea in situ o virtualmente, así como a las y los directores y colegas de la CEPAL que nos están acompañando. La presentación de este documento será realizada por el secretario ejecutivo de la CEPAL, don José Manuel Salazar Cirinach, quien entregará las principales conclusiones de este informe. Nos acompaña también en la testera los oficiales de Asuntos Económicos de la División de Comercio Internacional y de Integración de la CEPAL, principales economistas responsables de este informe, Keiji Inoue, oficial a cargo de la división, Miriam Sade, Sebastián Herreros, José Durán y Nano Molder, a quien les agradecemos también que nos acompañen en este lanzamiento. Como es habitual, como saben bien, luego de la presentación daremos paso a la ronda de preguntas de las y los periodistas. Les recordamos a los representantes de los medios de comunicación social acreditados virtualmente que nos envíen sus consultas por escrito vía el chat en la plataforma Webex a través de la cual están conectados la mayoría de ellos o al correo conferenciaprensa@cepal.org. De mi parte, secretario ejecutivo, la palabra es suya.
Muchísimas gracias, Guido. Muy buenos días a todos y todas, personas en sala y conectadas. Quiero agradecer a Keiji Inoue y a todo el equipo de la División de Comercio e Integración, algunos de los cuales están acá, ya fue mencionado, por la elaboración de esta edición 2025 del reporte Perspectivas del Comercio Internacional, que este año tiene como subtítulo El comercio internacional en la nueva era de interdependencia instrumentalizada. Este ha sido sin duda un año en que la dinámica del comercio mundial ha estado marcada por profundos cambios en la política comercial, en particular de los Estados Unidos. Estos cambios, cuya manifestación más visible han sido las alzas generalizadas de aranceles, se han traducido en una ruptura con las normas del sistema multilateral de comercio y con la mayoría de los acuerdos comerciales
negotiated by the United States since the 80s. This profound shift has its background in a new stage that the world economy is going through, which has been described by this term that we read fully in the media, which is a weaponized interdependence. This concept refers to the use of economic instruments to achieve geopolitical objectives by intervening in trade agreements and financial flows and also accessing technologies. Indeed, today, trade and geopolitics no longer run on independent tracks, but are increasingly interrelated. In short, we're facing a new scenario, a new commercial scenario in full reconfiguration, and that brings with it a significant increase in uncertainty that will continue to accompany us in the coming years. This 2025 edition of the report has 3 chapters. The first discusses the prospects for global and regional trade. The second one analyzes the impact of the new U.S. trade policy on the region. And the third analyzes the technological intensity and advanced human capital in the region's exports of goods and services, and the challenges to improve these dimensions, including recommendations on how to do so. I'm going to present the first 2 chapters, and then I will offer the floor to Keiji, the director of the division, to present the 3rd chapter. Regarding the outlook for global and regional trade, the main conclusion based on the data and projections is that both global and regional trade remain buoyant in 2025, but that a deterioration is expected for 2026. That is the big title of the big summary, and we're going to delve into detail. The most important feature in trade is this profound shift in U.S. trade policy, which has which is the technological rivalry of the United States with China. This is a trend that has been observed for 10 years or more, which has deepened, and that led several administrations of the U.S. to adopt various types of defensive responses or containment measures. The reasons expressed by the current administration for the increase of tariffs include several objectives and logics. The ones that you can read there: reducing trade deficits, reindustrialization and attracting investment to the United States, increased revenue, control of irregular migration and drug trafficking, and also various policy objectives, not necessarily of a commercial or economic nature, even that are reasons that are outside the economic realm. The fact is that the average effective tariff of the United States went this year from 2.4% in January this year to 17.4% in September, average tariff, which is the highest level since 1935. As a result of the frequent changes introduced since January and the differentiated manner in which they have been applied, the tariff structure of the United States is now highly diverse and complex. This structure combines four main elements: a base tariff of 10% applicable to most products imported from more than 100 trading partners. The so-called reciprocal tariffs applied to around 70 partners, ranging from 15 to 50%. Tariffs of between 25 and 100% in specific sectors, regardless of their origin, such as, for example, automobiles and their parts, steel, aluminum, wood, patented medicines, among others. And a list of products excluded from the hikes, such as oil, critical minerals, personal computers, cell phones, among others. In general, the 10% base tariff applies to partners that have a small weight in total U.S. trade, or with which the United States has a trade surplus. This is the case for most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, as we will see in chapter number 2. Now, reciprocal tariffs, on the other hand, apply to the main trading partners of the United States, and although they may not be significant partners, have surpluses with the U.S. This is important to emphasize that there's no clear correlation between a partner's weight in total U.S. imports of goods and the tariff imposed on that partner. For example, as seen in this chart, India and Switzerland face some of the highest tariffs, 50 and 39% respectively, despite their share of U.S. imports is relatively low, only 2.7% and 1.9%, respectively. Mexico is the only country in Latin America among the top 12 U.S. trading partners, and in fact, it is main trading partner individually, only surpassed by the EU's 27 members combined. Although a 25% tariff has been imposed on Mexico, it only applies to products that do not meet the USMCA rules of origin. The same thing applies to Canada, and we'll see further details about soon.
Now, despite overall disruptions and in the U.S., because of the U.S., we have seen that there has been for the first 8 months of 2025, the volume of world trading goods expanded by 4.7% compared to the same period in 2024. Now, this figure is more than double its annual average rate of expansion between 2011-2024. Now, this high dynamism in world trade in goods was strongly driven by the 9.4% year-on-year increase in imports by the U.S. And this is explained by, and I'll tell you what, and it's important to understand this to not get confused, it's explained by the advance of purchase orders from companies in that country, what we call front-loading, especially in the first quarter of this year, which is a rational response by importers to avoid the tariff hikes that were anticipated to come into force in April. The U.S. is the world's leading importer of goods with a 14% share of total global imports. Now, this weight and the dynamism of U.S. imports because of this anticipation phenomenon is largely due to the advancement of purchase orders, again, contributed to the good performance of world exports, especially from Asia. As we can see on the left side of the chart, you can see the growth in exports and from the Asian developed economies, China, Japan, ASEAN. And this, however, is obviously a temporary effect, not permanent. And this is one of the main reasons why it is expected that the full impact of the tariff hike will be felt more in 2026 and less so in this year, in 2025. As for the European Union, unlike the US, in the first 8 months of the year, European imports grew only at 1.2%. This is largely explained by the low economic growth of Europe and by the slight drop in its exports of 0.6%, because 60% of the EU's exports go to the EU itself. As far as China's concerned, during the first 8 months of this year, the exports grew by 8.6%. And the imports dropped by less than 0.4%, mainly due to weak consumption. Now, this is a very interesting chart, as we can see, because it refers to growth revisions and projections for 2025. We know that there have been significant adjustments to the projections for global trade in goods in this over the past 12 months. Now, in blue, you can see that the WTO projected an expansion of world trade for 2025 of 3%, similar to that recorded in 2024, which was 2.8%. Now, however, in April 2025, the WTO drastically revised its projection to a 0.2% drop, as you can see here, given the large magnitude of the tariff hikes announced by the U.S. on April 2nd, the so-called Liberation Day. Now, since then, there have been 2 new revisions to the 2025 projections, both upwards in August to 0.9% in green, and you can see that the chart in October to 2.4%. And this is due to 2 main causes. First of all, the tariff levels in the U.S. have tended to stabilize at levels lower than those initially announced. And it also helped that most of the U.S. trading partners have been cautious and have refrained from raising their own tariffs. And secondly, as we have already seen, the effect of the advance of imports and the accumulation of inventories, which boosted trade more than initially expected. Now, in contrast to the 2025 projections, successive revisions to the 2026 global trade projections reflect a continued deterioration. Each revision reflects a drop. According to the latest WTO projection, this would only grow by 0.5% in 2026. All right, then, so let's now take a peek at trade projections for the region. Let's first look at how trade in goods has behaved and then in services. Now, by 2025, the value of the region's exports of goods is projected to increase by 5%, as you can see in the graph on the left, slightly higher than the expansion recorded in 2024, which was 4.5%. Now, this growth is explained by an increase in the volume exported of 4% and a rise in prices of 1%. In the case of imports, an increase of 6% is projected for 2025, resulting from an increase in volume of 7% and a drop in prices of 1%. Now, at the sub-regional level, the largest increases in expected exports of goods are in the Caribbean and Central America at 16% and 14% respectively. The strong expansion in the Caribbean is explained by the 23% increase in the volume exported, which compensates for the fall in prices, which determines a net increase of 16% in value. Guyana, Suriname, the Bahamas, and the Dominican Republic are the countries that contribute to the most to the expansion of the volume exported in that subregion. In the case of Central America, we have also seen that a strong growth in volume exported is also projected, mainly to the U.S., underscored by an increase in the volume of copper exports from Panama, where growth was 100%, since they were exports of stored products. After overcoming the necessary permits, the mining company First Quantum Minerals was able to export more than 8,000 tons of copper that it had in stock after the closure of the mine in 2023. As far as volume imported, it's expected to see that will have a higher greater growth than that of prices in all subregions. For Mexico, the main export in the region, an increase of shipments of 5% is expected, 4% in volume, 1% in price, and this expansion is led by exports of manufactured goods to the U.S., although its vehicle and oil exports did suffer year-on-year declines of 4% and 25% respectively between January and August of this year. Exports from other manufacturers reported significant increases, higher than 12% on average. This chart presents exports of goods in 2025 for all of the countries in the region in terms of value. As you can see, most countries in the region are projected to increase the value of their goods exported this year. The largest increases would occur in Guyana, 38%, and Panama, 36%, driven by the oil shipments in the case of Guyana and copper inventories in the case of Panama. Also noteworthy are the double-digit increases projected for several Central American and Caribbean countries, driven by higher export volumes, mainly to the U.S. Now, the only countries whose shipments would fall are Cuba by 7% and Venezuela, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, by 9%. In the case of Cuba, this is mainly due to the reduced sugarcane harvest and the fall in the price of nickel, while in the case of Venezuela, due to the fall in both the price and volumes of oil exports. Now, this chart distinguishes the exports by sector at the top, and these are the blue bars, and by trading partners at the bottom in green bars. Now, by sector, the most dynamic exports will be manufacturing, 7%, driven by shipments to the U.S., and those of agricultural products by 5%, driven primarily by shipments to China. Mining and oil exports would fall 5%, and this is a drop that is explained by the fall in the price of oil. Now, by partner or destination market, we can see that the largest increases in 2025, largest increase is expected to be in exports to China, 7% growth, the bar on the bottom, mainly associated with growth in the sale of meat and soybean, as well as higher prices for minerals such as copper. This will also be followed by shipments to the European Union that would grow by 6%, and to the US expected to be at 5%. For intra-regional trade, modest growth is projected of only 1%, and that's why we are emphasizing our recommendations with regard to how to face this situation and the importance of focusing on regional integration and regional dynamism. As for the imports, the projected great dynamism of purchases from China of 13%, and from the rest of the Asia stands out at 18%. Now let's look at the price issue. Overall, the prices of the region's main export commodities remained at the same level on average, but with a significant dispersion, as one can see in this graph. Price increases were led by natural gas, which had exceptional demand due to extreme temperatures during the northern summer, which required greater electricity generation. And then we see the increase in the prices of certain foods such as coffee, cocoa, beef, chicken, soybean oil, as well as minerals and metals such as gold, tin, silver, copper, and aluminum. As far as lower prices, we can see those of energy, oil, and oil-related products, and coal stand out. Significant falls were also recorded in another group of basic food staples, for example, such as sugar, wheat, and soybeans. As far as services are concerned, we are only going to show you this graph, or two graphs actually, which show, among other things, that the value of exports of services is going to increase by 8%, which is growth greater than 5% that we will greater than 5% that we will see in trades of goods. Now, however, this is 1 point less than the growth in services recorded in 2024. We're talking about 8% growth. Now, as far as service imports, a 5% growth is projected, and the graphs actually show the annual value of exports and imports of services over the last 10 years from 2015 to 2025. Now, the rates I mentioned for 2025 are lower than those of the post-pandemic period, and this is explained by the rebound effect of the post-pandemic recovery period and the sharp deterioration of the travel component, which plummeted trade and services in 2022. Now, if we look at this by component, we can see that modern services are the ones that will make the greatest contribution to the total growth of regional exports of services in 2025. That is more than 60% of the growth in services are going to correspond to modern services this year. And the second most important component is travel, that is tourism. In the case of imports of services, the main contribution comes from travel. As for transport services in 2025, as in 2024 and 2023, transport plays a very small role in dynamism. And this is mainly due to weakening of freight transport mobility on the one hand, and on the other hand, to the low growth expectations of regional production, which is estimated at 2.3%. I will now summarize the main points of Chapter 2. This chapter analyzes the region's trade relationship with the U.S. and the impacts, current and likely impacts of changes in U.S. trade policy. Okay, as you know, just for a bit of perspective, in 2025, we have seen this major shift that we have already explained. But if we look backwards quickly, we can see that since the 1950s, the U.S. has been a promoter of free trade in the world and throughout the region. The region had unilateral free access to well, in the region, there's unilateral free access given to the countries of Central America and the Caribbean during the 80s under the initiative called Caribbean Basin Initiative. And the policy of reciprocal free trade was even furthered with the negotiation and entry into force of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which included Mexico and Canada in the early 90s. And this came also simultaneously practically with the launch of the idea of creating a free trade area of the Americas, the FTAA, which had a preparatory period from 1995 to 1998, and then followed by formal negotiations that were launched in 1998. Now, the FTAA, as we all know, unfortunately, was not concluded, partly because of internal issues regarding negotiations, and also partly because of the arrival in Latin America of some governments that thought that the FTAA was a bad idea. Now, this led the U.S. to continue offering to negotiate free trade agreements with countries or groups of countries that wanted to. And under this approach, several agreements were concluded. For example, the free trade agreement with Central America and the Dominican Republic, known as CAFTA, and bilateral agreements with Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Panama. And of course, then with Mexico, NAFTA. Now, this U.S. free trade policy with the region changed significantly this year with the establishment of tariffs on all countries that we've already described in Chapter 1. In fact, tariffs were even higher for countries that had free trade agreements, with the exception of the USMCA. But bilateral negotiations continue, and in fact, there have been recent announcements to reduce some of the tariffs placed in April for some countries.
Well, here in this chart on the left, you can see the evolution of exports. We'll see the evolution of trade in between Latin America and the U.S. compared to 2024. As can be seen in 2024, total trade in goods between the region and the US exceeded $1 trillion. It's a trillion in English, of course, almost tripling its value in current terms since 2000, which is the green line on the chart to the left. The region's exports went from $200 billion in 2000 to $646 billion in 2024. And its imports went from just under 200 billion to 421 billion dollars in that same period. It is of great interest to note that, as a chart on the right shows, during the entire period from 2000 to 2024, the region as a whole kept a surplus in its trading goods with the U.S. That is to say that as a region, we export to the U.S. more than we import from it. But this is interesting. Since 2009, this surplus is mainly due to Mexico's growing surplus, which is the one that you can see in the dotted line. In 2024, Mexico's surplus reached $251 billion. Now, if we exclude Mexico from 2008 to date, that is the red line to the right on the chart, that is to say almost in 2 decades, Latin America and the Caribbean has registered a trade deficit with the U.S. In other words, without Mexico since 2008, the region has imported more from the U.S. than that it exports. The region has made a net, although modest, contribution to reduce the U.S. Trade deficit with the world. So this is a first structural characteristic of trade in goods between the U.S. and the region. We have the Latin America surplus. If Mexico is included, a deficit for the rest of the region without taking Mexico into consideration. Now, a second structural feature, or rather structural change of the trade relationship between Latin America and the Caribbean with the U.S. is that the United States remains as the main trading partner of the region in aggregate terms, but it has reduced its weight in the region's trade in goods, while the region has increased its weight in total U.S. trade. As can be seen to the left, the U.S. went from representing 56% of total exports from Latin America in 2000 to representing 44% in 24. Very important, but 12 percentage points less. Now, in terms of the region's total imports, the reduction is even further, from 46 to 28%. This situation reflects the emergence of China as a trading partner of the region in the last 20 years to consolidate itself as its second trading partner. In contrast, and for this, you can see the chart on the right, the weight of Latin America and the Caribbean in total trade in goods from the U.S. has increased during this century. The region went from accounting for 22% of the country's total exports in 2000 to 26% in 24. And in imports, it went from 17% to 20% in the same period. So that is the second structural feature that we mentioned. Then there's a third one, which is this one. Mexico accounts for the bulk of total trade in goods between the U.S. and the region. This high concentration reflects the deep integration that is developed in terms of production or production networks and supply chains in the so-called the North America factory. In 24, Mexico was the destination of 63% of U.S. exports to the region and the origin of 75% of its imports from the region. It's followed by Brazil, Colombia, and Chile, all with shares of less than 10% in both flows. A fourth structural feature of trade between the U.S. and the region is that the U.S. weighs much more heavily in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean trade than in South America. In terms of exports, as can be seen in this chart to the left, in 24, the U.S. accounted for an average of 45% of the region's total export, the red line. However, with huge difference among countries, 81% of Mexico's exports go to the U.S., 59% of those are from the Dominican Republic, and almost half of those from Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Honduras. But In contrast, the share of the United States in the total exports of most South American countries did not exceed 15%. Similarly, it can be seen in the chart to the right. Mexico and the Central American countries and Caribbean countries account for the largest share of their total imports from the US. And on average, 29% of Latin America and the Caribbean imports come from the US. And the fifth structural characteristic is that the region is a major supplier of the US of both manufacturing and natural resource-based products. There we see the breakdown in the case of manufactured products. The region's weight is specifically high in the automotive industry. For example, in 24, 79% of US imports of vehicles came from the region, as did 65% of tractors, 41% of auto parts, 23% of passenger vehicles. The region also accounted for 44% of its imports of medical instruments and appliances and 34% of its imports of personal computers and accessories. In all these products, Mexico is the main, and in some cases the only one or exclusive supplier in the region. Among the other countries in the region, Brazil is the second largest supplier of the United States of medium-sized aircraft, Embraer exports, while Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic stand out as suppliers of medical instruments and appliances, and Guatemala and Honduras and Nicaragua in terms of clothing manufacturing. As to natural resource-based products, the region was the origin of all U.S. imports of banana, 97% of grapes, 90% of flours, 89% of sugar, almost 80% of refined copper, more than 60% of coffee, and 56% of fruit juices in 24. Several South American countries stand out as suppliers: Brazil in coffee, sugar, and fruit juice, Chile in terms of refined copper, fish, and grapes, Colombia in coffee, flowers, and gold, Ecuador in bananas and flowers, and Peru in terms of grapes and refined copper. As well, outside of South America, Guatemala stands out in bananas and coffee, Honduras in coffee, and Mexico in terms of gold. Let's now turn to trade in services. Unlike goods, the U.S. consistently maintains a surplus in its trade in services with Latin America. On the left, you see that trade in services between the U.S. and Latin America reached 213 billion in 2023. That's the last year for which information is available for all partners. This figure is equivalent to 21% of the value of bilateral trade in goods in the same year. In 23, Latin America accounted for 12% of both total U.S. exports and service imports. The chart on the right shows a breakdown of trade balance by service subsector. The United States has surpluses with America in most categories associated with modern services, that is to say, those that are can be delivered by digital means, also financial services, telecommunications, as well as intellectual property. Now, the region has surpluses in the traditional transport sectors, and especially travel and tourism. Well, in order to close, let's review the tariffs applied by the U.S. to trade in goods by country, which are the ones presented in this chart. In January, the effective tariff, as said at the beginning, faced by Latin America and the Caribbean exports to the U.S. was less than 1%. It was even 0% for 11 countries that had free trade agreements with the U.S. However, as a result of the hikes applied in February 2025, the average tariff faced by exports is close to 10% on average. Within the region, the situation varies widely. The highest average tariff faced by Brazil is 23%. Along with India, Brazil have been two countries in the world that have been imposed a general tariff of 50%. Although in the case of Brazil, with several products that are excluded, such as aircraft, orange juice, and cellulose. Now Brazil is followed by Uruguay with an average tariff 20%, and Nicaragua 18%. Mexico faces an average tariff of only 8%, well below the official general tariff of 25%. And this is because most of the exports enter tariff-free, either because they are taking advantage of the USMCA or because they are excluded from the increases, as is especially the case with exports from the electronic industry. Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Jamaica, and Venezuela also face average tariffs that are below the regional average. This is explained by the high weight in their exports to the US of products excluded from the increases, such as copper, tin, copper cathodes, oil, and its derivatives. Importantly, the average tariff faced by the region's exports in the US is 7 percentage points lower than the US average tariff for the entire world, which is 17%. This is because most of the US major trading partners face tariffs between 15 and 30, and in some cases up to 50%. So, in summary, for the region, the tariff situation in the US is worse than at the beginning of the year, but better than the one faced by its competitors. This situation opens up opportunities for trade diversion in favor of the region's exports in sectors such as clothing, medical devices, and agribusiness. A couple of things before I close this chapter number 2. There have been several recent announcements after we concluded the report a few days ago that are important to remember. On November 13th, the U.S. government announced its first 4 free trade agreements with Argentina, Ecuador, and Guatemala. To date, the U.S. had completed negotiations with Asia and Europe, but these are the first ones with countries in Latin America. They're similar, but with certain differences. The similar aspects have the elimination of tariffs for imported products that are not grown or produced in the U.S. Added the alignment of for textiles and clothing, especially Salvador and Guatemala, the reduction and elimination of tariffs or non-tariff barriers from the countries, together with commitments of openness and intellectual property, digital trade, and labor regulations, among other things. Also, November 13th, several agricultural products that the region exported to the U.S., such as coffee, cocoa, beef, bananas, pineapples, mangoes, etc., were excluded from the tariff hikes. Of course, for these countries, those negotiations are good news. It is also important to note that another key aspect that connects trade with investment, foreign direct investment. The uncertainty caused by the changes in U.S. trade policies affecting the foreign direct investment flows to the region, as it can be seen in this chart regarding the announcements of FDI in the first half of 2025. FDI project announcements in the region reached $31.3 billion, 53% less than in the same period of 2024. Large year-on-year declines were recorded in the amount of project announcements in several sectors, among automobiles, auto parts. There you see the reduction percentages: industrial equipment, consumer products, metals, and minerals. And now to summarize. This chapter examines some structural characteristics of some of them and trends of trade between Latin America, the Caribbean, and the US, and the impacts of new US trade policies on Latin America and the Caribbean in terms of the structural trends. You see the main aspects, the 5 trends or changes. Latin America and the Caribbean has a surplus with the U.S. in trade and goods. Mexico is included in a deficit in Mexico, that the U.S. remains as a main trading partner, but has reduced its weight in regions trading goods, while the region has increased its weight in total U.S. trade. Mexico accounts for the bulk of total trade in goods between the U.S. and the region, 63%, and exports 75%. In imports, the U.S. weighs much more heavily in the trade of Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. That the region is a major supplier to the U.S. of both manufacturers and natural resource-based products. And in services, the U.S. consistently maintains a surplus in its trade in services with Latin America. Impacts. Well, we said that for the region, the tariff situation in the U.S. is worse than at the beginning of the year, but better than the one faced by its competitors. This opens up opportunities for a trade diversion in favor of some exports from the region, such as clothing, medical devices, and agribusiness. However, the situation is subject to great uncertainty. That despite recent announcements of the later days, agreements for countries in the region, somehow this commercial practice will remain in the coming years. What do we recommend? Well, three things um, for the countries in the region. First, a geographically diversified trade, deepening relations with established partners such as the EU, China, and emerging partners such as India, the countries of the ASEAN countries, the Persian Gulf countries in Africa, and also in this aspect, cautious, not to do things to make things worse by provoking or making actions that somehow will worsen the tariffs. And second, to form alliances within outside the region to defend rules-based trade with smaller countries, those that are not big powers. They should follow a logic in a world trade that is that follows rules. So we're working towards keeping as much as possible the rules in terms of investment and trade. And third, deepening regional integration. It can be a great source of growth, additional growth. On average for the entire subcontinent, we have 13-14% of interregional trade versus total trade. So how to deepen that integration? Well, for South America, for example, the issue of infrastructure, there's a huge project of roads and interconnecting roads, and those kinds of actions are key in order to keep physical interconnectivity, trade facilitation, which has to do with customs and those topics, and regulatory convergence.
Thank you for that. And now I will give the floor to KG, who will refer to the final chapter entitled Technological and Advanced Human Capital Intensity of Exports of Goods and Services. And this is a classical chapter. Thank you to the Executive Secretary. And yes, precisely the issue of high-level technological and advanced human capital exports of goods and services is one of the areas that we recommend developing, specifically given the global complex context that the Executive Secretary has described and analyzed. All right, then. Now, in addition to everything that we have focused on this study as well, because according to studies, the developing countries that have grown more and that have also been able to converge their per capita income are the countries whose production has been focused on the technological and highly advanced human capital goods. And we have also seen that manufacturing of these goods has driven export diversification as well as modern services that have become more dynamic. And we have seen increased innovation in services sectors extremely that produce these two types of goods and services. And for Latin America, well, at ECLAC, we have insisted on the 3 development traps, and at ECLAC, we believe that these sectors with technological and advanced human capital sectors are key for leaving behind the first trap, which is low growth capacity. Now, this chapter obviously is a chapter in which we analyze these different types of goods and services. Now, on the left, we have a graph that shows 5 classifications for goods, and this originally was given by the economist Santiago Lal. And here we start with the primary goods are the most simple ones, or those with the least level of added value and technological level, followed by natural resource-based manufacturing. And then we have the 3 technological levels, high, mid, and low. And we here underscore how high-level manufactured goods in green are the goods that have grown the most over the last 2 decades. In fact, they have tripled since 2005 until 2024. While on the modern services side, we have classified these in low, mid, high, and this is based on the level of human capital employed at the work level, the labor level of those exporting these services. And we can see that the high human capital content services are the most dynamic ones in the region. And those services have increased fivefold over these years. Therefore, on the goods side, on the left, we can see that the share of these high-tech goods correspond to 30% of all the exported goods from the region. Speaker corrects himself, not from the region, but from the world. We're still referring to the global scenario. And on the services side, we can see that they correspond to more than half of the exported services globally. Therefore, one can see how these two sectors and products are the most dynamic ones, in addition to holding the greatest share of global goods and services. Now, if we take a peek at the key players globally, again, we can see that the European Union leads the exports of high technology goods. And given the intra-regional trade, the European Union has developed this sector further. And at ECLAC, we have also emphasized the role of intra-regional trade as a way to launch these products. We see that in the European Union, there has been a drop in the region's share from 36% in 2025 to less than 30%, while China has increased its participation from 10% to roughly 20% during the same period, for the period from 2005 to 2025, while the US in blue, the blue line, has remained stagnant. And this slightly explains what is occurring globally, and that is this loss of comparative advantage when comparing the US to China. As far as services are concerned, we also see that the European Union is leading with a share of more than 35% in exported services, while the US is in second place in terms of the second exporter of these modern services at 15%. And we see that China only exports 5% of the total global lot. And this is partly explained because the modern services produced by China are consumed in the same Chinese domestic market more than anything. And then there's a lesser percentage that is exported globally. Now, let us delve into the regional context. We see on the goods side, we see high tech manufacturing led by Mexico by far, with 85% of all regional exports of these products, followed by Brazil, which has also slightly dropped its share in exports of these products, given the deindustrialization that we have recently seen in Brazil, and followed by Costa Rica with 3%, given its competitive advantage in medical devices and other high-tech products. I think it's worth underscoring this. And let's look at the service side now. Contrary to what we have seen in the goods side, we see that the players, the exporters in modern services is much more diverse, led by Brazil this time around, followed by Mexico. Brazil has always had a significant longstanding tradition in financial services and business services, first domestically speaking, but Brazil has also been able to export these to other countries. And this, again, is reflected in this 33%. Then we see Argentina and Costa Rica tied for third place. And this shows that regardless of the country's size, the countries are able to export this type of services, modern services. For example, we see that in mid-sized countries, Colombia, Chile, Uruguay, they do this, as well as other smaller countries such as Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, and Panama, continue to be key players in this service sector. Now, if we look at the main categories of high-tech manufactured goods, we can see that they tend to correspond to processing machines, followed by automobiles. Both of these sectors have been growing over the last 20 years, while electronics and telecommunications equipment have been have shown a drop in their share. And this can be explained by greater competition by the Asian countries in these high-tech sectors. Here, I would like to focus on two niche sectors in terms of high-tech goods. For example, in the case of Costa Rica, we have medical devices, and Costa Rica has been able to boost its exports from 0.4% to more than $7 billion over the last 25 years. But what's most important, if we look at the bars and the different components making up these bars, we can see how Costa Rica began exporting disposable devices and then gradually expanded its medical device sector, including therapeutic devices and image diagnostic services. So this has shown that Costa Rica has been able to scale up its activities in this medical device chain, and they have been supported by FDI and boosting in its manufacturing capacity. Now, we look at Brazil and its position in mid-size aeronautics. It actually holds fourth place in this niche sector, and this is primarily explained by Embraer exports. Embraer has been able to position itself quite well in the mid-size aircraft sector, followed by larger companies such as Airbus and Boeing, for example. Regarding services, we can see that most of these services are business services, 60%, followed by telecommunications, informatics, 20-odd%. So this is the bulk of the modern services that are actually exported from Latin America, followed by financial services. Here I wanted to underscore a niche sector, again, that is called the knowledge process outsourcing sector, KPO. This sector calls for a high level of advanced human capital, sophisticated capital, and specialized knowledge in a variety of different sectors. And the region accounts for roughly 5% of the global KPO market, but that's nothing to sneeze at. There are several Latin American countries standing out, such as Argentina, the Globe and Mercado Libre, and then we have Totus and Stefani in Brazil, and Sonda in Chile. And all of this calls for having a strong workforce in STEM careers and the ability to develop digital skill sets, as well as having advanced analytics as well. Now, if we compare the level of qualification with regard to goods and services first in general terms, we can see that as far as services are concerned, the qualification level is relatively higher than it is for goods, 24 versus 15% of highly skilled human capital. And this can be explained primarily by modern services. Here we can see, and as we saw in one of the slides presented by the executive secretary for the region, this corresponds to a bulk of the total regional service exports. For example, we can see that as far as business services are concerned, more than half of human capital is high level, highly skilled human capital. And 42% corresponds to financial services, for example. And then this, of course, is followed by goods exports and the most sophisticated service, pharmaceuticals, followed by non-energy mining with 22%, chemicals and fuels as well, both with 24%, and then a share of highly skilled human capital. So concluding, as we can see, these high-tech goods and knowledge-intensive services, the most dynamic segments in global trade and regionally as well. But the region also has a low share, less than 5%. And the key players are Mexico, especially Mexico with regard to high-tech goods, as we've seen, at roughly 80%, followed by Brazil and Costa Rica. And as far as modern services, Brazil is leading the pack, followed by Mexico, Argentina, and Costa Rica at 10%. So in order to take full advantage of these sectors that are so dynamic, we need to have policies and production emphasis and productive factors and development institutional capacities I will refer to now.
These are the policies that will be required. We have 4 of them, which are the regulatory frameworks, attracting foreign direct investment, export promotion connected to this type of investment, regional integration, as we have mentioned, close to 15% of exports of goods are marketed within the region, which shows that there's still a huge potential in this area, and only 9% of those services are destined for the region itself. And this is surprising because we have a common language and business features that are similar within the region, but only we export 9% of those modern services. Now, in terms of the productive factors, of course, science, technology, and innovation is one of the most important. And for this, we need to develop human talent, not only in terms of STEM, but also foreign languages. And as a support, we need a digital transformation, infrastructure, and financing to be able to support these factors and these productive development policies. Something that we are emphasizing as well at ECLAC are the institutional capabilities, and we know that there are 4 types of capabilities that are essential to promote not only these sectors. So the first one is technical capabilities, which is knowledge, methodologies, and tools. And 2 examples that I wanted to highlight are the DANE in Colombia, that has been able to develop with at a very granular level different services precisely. Within the region, we still need to do a standardization effort. Procomer from Costa Rica, that has not only been awarded a prize for their trade promotion, but sustainable trade has been rewarded as that. Operational capabilities are the ones that are administrative and management skills, and digital talent, and finishing schools from Uruguay and the first one from Chile that have been able to do a matchmaking of the needs or the demands of these dynamic sectors that I've just shown, precisely with human capital. Political capabilities are also important, which are the ability not only to articulate shared visions, but also establishing alliances and establishing leadership within the public sector and in the private sector. And one example is the Public-Private Committee on Exports of Chile. And obviously, we need prospective foresight capabilities to anticipate trends, especially in at this complex juncture we're at. And an example we found was the artificial intelligence plan from Brazil. Okay, now just in closing, I'd like to offer the floor back again to the Executive Secretary. But very quickly, just to say that tying up everything, all the messages and everything, first of all, I should highlight that this is a unique year, a very significant year in terms of global trade. That's why the name of global trade in the new era of weaponized interdependence because of the big changes. Second, the recommendations we are providing is that, which is geographically diversifying trade. In fact, we've seen that some initiatives have been started. There have been visitors to China, to India, to the EU. One of the obvious actions that must be adopted, building alliances within and outside the region, working on a rule-based trade, and also deepening regional integration. And finally, what KG Noi just presented, which is in order to boost the long-term development, the issue is the content in terms of the quality of the human resources and technology of the exports, both of goods and services, is a classic topic. Development is important. We have learned a lot about how to do it. Basically, these 7 policy areas and productive factors, the human talent is huge. Without human talent in this era of technological revolution, of AI, and digital transformation is absolutely essential. And also strengthening the institutional capabilities. We've been emphasizing this in terms of the how. We need to have strong and capable institutions to manage the necessary transformations. Thank you very much. We'd like to thank the Executive Secretary. So we'll start the exchange with the journalists with your questions. First, I don't know if any of the professionals present here would like to ask a question, or if not, we're going to go straight to those questions that have been sent through digital means. First of all, so questions from Daniel Salazar, Bloomberg, who asks, it's a number of questions actually. The first one, what explains that the perspectives of foreign trade deteriorating for 2026 in Latin America, what can be expected of the situation with the US in 25 and 26? And will they deteriorate because of the tariff noise? If the tariff hike during 2025 will have an impact on exports to China, and how that does reflect for the next year? What does it look like Guyana and Panama are driving the value of goods exports in 2025? What countries highlight the stand out in terms of service exports in the region? All of those comments from Mr. Salazar, representing Bloomberg. Thank you, Daniel. It's 5 questions, it's not 1 question. But thank you. Thank you, Daniel, for your interest. What does explain the trade perspectives, especially the fact that they deteriorated in Latin America? We should say that this is a global situation. I explained that World Trade Organization reduces 0.5% of only trade in the coming year. So it is the entire world that is suffering from this. And of course, it has the specific features that we just explained for Latin America. We said something very important, which is that the region has been impacted by a number of tariffs imposed by the US. With all the detail we gave you about that, impact is lower compared to other countries in Asia, for example, and that opens up trade opportunities. So within the bad news, there are some good news, or at least good opportunities for the region. That in terms of the perspectives, the details are in the document in our presentation. Second, what can we expect from the goods balance between Latin America and the US for 2026? Will it deteriorate? Well, that's a structural feature that the region as a whole kept a surplus. But it's different with or without Mexico when you exclude and include Mexico. Something important to understand, especially because the main reason that the US gave in order to set this policy is what is the deficit situation with the countries. Understand that Mexico is the only country that has surplus. It's not the only country, but the entire region has if we add them up, has a deficit. Third, increased tariffs has had an indirect impact of opening up opportunities. Yes, that's true. We mentioned how an opportunity window opened up for Argentina and Brazil in terms of soybean and other products, given the tariffs that the US imposed. Well, China did as well as a response to the US tariff policy. But in this recent agreement, what China arrived at with the US, the tariffs are reduced again on the part of China, which means that this advantage and this growth, important growth that exports experienced in terms of soy being, for example, from Brazil and Argentina, flattens out the situation. It's a kind of a temporary advantage. And if the agreement is complied with at the beginning of the year, the situation will go back to before the tariff hike, especially for those products. But there are advantages for other products, for textiles, and in these agreements for Central American countries. So we need to look at it good by good, and there are some advantages compared to the tariffs for the rest of the world. But as explained, the Guyana and Panama keep driving the role of goods and services exports in 2025. Well, the biggest increases that are forecasted are high in Guyana, 38%, and Panama, 36%. We explained that one is explained by oil, and the other one is explained by copper that was sitting there in a stockpile. And the only countries with shipments that will drop are Cuba and Venezuela. And we also explained why of those drops and what countries stand out in terms of service exports in the region. Well, KG and mentioned that, and I did as well. What is the service export breakdown? Brazil 35%, Mexico 70%, Argentina 10% are the main exporters. Between 2005 and 24, largest breakthrough is Costa Rica and Colombia. They grew significantly in that regard. Costa Rica went from accounting 3 to account for 10% of total exported services in the region, which is a very large proportion for a small country. And Colombia doubled its share from 3 to 6%. I believe what's important is to say what this means, that the service sector, especially modern services, that countries need to look at cautiously, because if they do that correctly, attracting FDI plus a local promotion plus the local startup ecosystems, well, there's a wager on productive development that may have relatively quick results. This service sector has economies of scale that are unimaginable in everything related to internet, much larger than economies of scale of the industry. Because if a business, let's think of a startup or the unicorns that have grown in Latin America, in a few years, they can go from being a SME or a startup to becoming a company that is worth billions of dollars that provides lots of employment. So just to connect this with our recommendations for productive development policies, what's important is for the countries to prioritize certain sectors and to have a strategic view of the territories as well, as they should work together with the private sector with this modern vision of productive development policies, because the returns can be significant.
Thank you, Executive Director. Carmen Esquivel, correspondent from the Prensa Latina agency, has the following question. Though the new scenario with regarding tariffs in terms of ECLAC for the countries, but what do you think this is an opportunity to increase interregional trade? It seems as that's one of the recommendations. And then the other question is, does ECLAC believe that the Trump administration's rise in tariffs could be a boomerang for the U.S.? This was from Carmen Esquivel from Prensa Latina. Go ahead, Executive Secretary. Okay, well, I thank you for your question, Carmen Esquivel. With regard to this, we were quite clear in saying this, and we reiterated there are 3 key recommendations for the countries. First, for the short term, do not take any actions that could escalate the trade situation and worsen things. Excuse me, the tariff situation and worsen things, and try to focus on a trade policy that involves negotiations. And if you have seen tariff increases, try to negotiate. We've seen the U.S. is willing to negotiate to try to have different actions. So again, that is the strategy that seems to be most intelligent given the situation. And secondly, in the midterm, initiatives aimed at diversifying your trade portfolio and your trade partners, that's crucial. And of course, it will depend on each country, but generally speaking, we know that the large markets are the EU, China, some Asian countries, India, Asian countries, the Persian Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia. Those are very dynamic markets, and Latin America has seen that there could be good, there are many good returns for Latin American companies and for growth, all related to growing revenue and jobs as well. And then thirdly, regional integration. We have been quite explicit in this regard. And of course, we need to talk more about how to do this, but it seems to be all quite clear. Now, the next question is whether or not all of this will be a boomerang for the United States. That's interesting that you use that term. As we know and has been mentioned, there have been some negative effects for the U.S. In fact, we were expecting to see an inflationary impact, and we're starting to see that, and it wasn't as strong as we expected, because many U.S. companies in the supermarkets, for example, have absorbed part of the tariff increase in their profit margin, but this is not necessarily sustainable. When the profit margins go back to a steady situation, that means that that's when they will transfer the impact of the trade tariff increases to the consumers. There have also been impacts on the companies, given an increase in the price of intermediate goods and production inputs. Now, these negative impacts are partly why the U.S. Has been negotiating and renegotiating. This is pragmatic, and it has been renegotiating some of the very high tariff rises because clearly this has had an impact on consumers in the U.S. and U.S. competitiveness. And I would have to say that that's the main reason why the U.S. MCA has been respected as the main trade agreement. We know that many North American industries, such as the automotive industry, relies truly on supply chains located either in Mexico or in Canada. And any obstacle or any tariff would have an impact, or does have an impact, on the competitiveness of multinationals and U.S. companies. Okay, thank you. Let's go to a question given by Candida Costa from Dominican Republic Journal. This person has a series of questions. First, as part of CAFTA DR, do you think the U.S. has violated this agreement with the tariffs on exports for the countries forming part of this agreement? President Trump has been changing its tariffs. Now the DR now has 10%. Costa Rica and Nicaragua have seen an increase to 15%. How does this most recent measure affect the region? Also, another question. If the DR maintains trade of $6 billion with the U.S. with a balance that favors Washington and cooperates with the anti-drug plan, does ECLAC think that the DR should not be on the list of countries experiencing a rise in tariffs? And then finally, how should the region face their high dependence on the U.S. market? Thank you, Candida Costa, for your questions. All right, well, we already said this, and the fact remains that the entirety of CAFTA has not been respected. The same applies to other trade agreements that have not been respected. And this is part of the big surprise of this major change, this major shift that we have seen this year. Latin American countries and other countries in good faith have announced agreements under the paradigm that the agreements would be respected. And even in the US, the agreements need to go through the Congress. There's an entire constitutional process for approval. And the world, up until recently, trusted in that those processes would be respected. And there has been controversy. And so the answer is no, they have not been respected. Again, on the flip side, we see that the U.S. has been willing to renegotiate. We saw that there were unilaterally imposed announcements at first, and now the U.S. has been open to sit down with the countries to renegotiate, but not to necessarily go back to the original agreement, but to go elsewhere. We know that that's the reality. The second question from Candida is, the DR had 10%, Costa Rica, another country, had an increase of 15%. And how does this, what's the effect of this? Well, there are distortions that may be the result of all of these decisions. Not the final point, though. We know there have been announcements over the last few days. And this is something that we need to keep an eye on. And all of these actions may lead to trade distortions or opportunities. There could be temporary windows of opportunity, but for some of the countries, these windows will not remain open forever. So that's the reality. You need to invest. The ministries of trade and the export chambers need to be very keen and following this situation. And a report such as ours, we believe, is helpful. It's helpful right now to put things into perspective, to understand the outlook and focus on specificities for different countries. Third question, the DR has $6 billion in trade with the US and cooperates with the anti-drug plan so if that's the case, why is the DR on this list? The Dominican Republic did have a $5 billion odd trade deficit with the US in 2024. But as we've seen, the logic was to help all these tariffs was to help reduce the U.S. trade deficit, but practically speaking, we have seen that the tariffs have not necessarily only done that. And we know that there are several objectives. Some were commercial in nature, but there are some tariffs that have been imposed due to other non-economic reasons or to other economic reasons apart from the balancing the deficit. And that's the reality of the situation. And it's not just in the DR, but there are other countries around the world that are facing this situation. So again, we need to know that this is a different paradigm. We do not have a level playing field in terms of the rules. We have unilateralism, and the outcomes are the results of the specific individual negotiations among trade partners. And the question with regard to how to deal with this, well, we have said on several occasions that there are 3 recommendations that we have provided to the country. So thank you. Okay, thank you. Daniel Colin from Guatemala has the following questions. Now, in the growth projection framework, we had growth prior to the U.S. tariffs. So what about Guatemala? Guatemala, El Salvador, and Argentina have reached agreements with regard to the tariffs. So the question is for KG. Thank you, Guido and Daniel, for your question.
Bueno, como hemos visto ya en
As we have seen on the chart regarding ECLAC projections, we saw that even prior to the November 13 framework agreement, we saw a growth in exports of 15% from Guatemala. And this is primarily explained, on the one hand, by the competitive advantage that Guatemala holds with regard to the effective tariffs imposed by the U.S. when compared to some of the other countries in Asia, primarily, that compete in similar exports in which Guatemala is engaged in clothing, for example. And so that's why we have projected this 15% increase. Now, we do know that this projection also includes a drop in agricultural product exports. We thought that that was going to have a negative impact, but after November 13th, as we've seen, that under this the general framework agreement, which is still negotiating, many of the agricultural products have been placed on the list of exceptions. And I would have to say that this, again, could have a positive impact on Guatemala's export portfolio. Thank you, KG. Jesus Alberto Zamora from Mexico. What is the outlook specifically for Mexico resulting from the tariffs? And what is ECLAC's diagnosis of the renegotiation of USMCA? Could the Executive Secretary please comment on this? Thank you to Jesus Zamora for your question. As we already said, Mexico is by far the country that exports the most to the U.S., 85% of the entire regional package. And this is an advantage on the one side, and it's one of the reasons well, we know that a great deal of the U.S. market depends on that chain, that service and goods chain, and so they're trying not to do much to damage U.S. situation. But this also makes Mexico particularly vulnerable to changes in the U.S. trade policy. Any intervention in the U.S. trade policy could have an impact. Now, thanks to the agreement, most of the products are included under the free trade agreement. Therefore, the average tariff applied is only 8% for Mexico, the real average, that is. Now, this comparative advantage brings about a 5% expansion of Mexico's goods and services in 2025 with a 10% increase in volume, and that has continued. And it is expected that as far as USMCA renegotiation is concerned, and practically speaking, the review process will be more of a renegotiation process, but we'll have to wait and see what the US will be requesting. Supposedly, this renegotiation was going to be launched this year, but apparently it will take place in June, July of 2026. It's likely that one of the US goals for this process will be to make changes to the agreement, leading to an increase in Chinese imports. We know that there's this triangle situation between China, US, Canada. There are some Chinese companies installed in Mexico and Canada, and there's this rule of origin that contributes to the added value and related to the Chinese products. And now clearly that is going to be one of the issues to be addressed under said review. Thank you.
Gustavo Ortega from La Nación newspaper, Costa Rica, with the following question: what are ECLAC's projections regarding the effects of tariffs in Central America? What can Costa Rica expect, and what countries in the region would be mostly affected? Second, in terms of exports, the main recommendation from you to face tariffs and any other international trade disruption. Gustavo Ortega from La Nación, Costa Rica. Thank you, Mr. Ortega. Well, forecasts about the effects of tariffs in Central America, we mentioned that already. In general, the average effective tariff grew from 2.4 to 17%, the highest since a long time. Mexico and Central America, on the one hand, are vulnerable to this because of the high export concentration on the U.S. market, but there's some announcements have been made with some exceptions, significant exceptions. So the issue of the impacts, one can study this today in the coming week with these negotiations are out of date. Well, it's something that we need to maintain. The circumstances call for constant or ongoing dialogue with the U.S. authorities. There are negotiations, and we know in several countries, in Costa Rica specifically, to reduce that tariff that is hurting the country, that 15% on medical appliances. Costa Rica was not included in this latest announcements, but negotiations are ongoing. So the expectation is that both for medical appliances and other products, well, they need to continue making that effort of commercial trade diplomacy to try to obtain reductions and improvements. And of course, our recommendations apply also to Costa Rica of diversifying, making efforts to diversify trade with Europe, with China, with Africa, with India, etc. And well, the presence of North American multinationals in modern services as well as in medical appliances. Those are sectors that in themselves can help in the US to prevent any setbacks or harmful actions from now on. Thank you, Executive Secretary, from Nayara Bachke from Associated Press. Following question. Fostering trade in the countries of the region is interesting, but what concrete measures or strategies can Latin American countries adopt if many of them rely on their trade with the US? Regional trade within Latin America, the Caribbean, would it be enough to substitute exports the US? But what other markets could compensate for This Nayara Vachke, representing Associated Press. Thank you, Nayara, for your question. We talked about the exporting dependence and how varies from Mexico with 80% to Central American countries and Caribbean countries between 60 and 30%, and in general, South America much less with 15%. So there are significant structural differences, except for Colombia. So there are incentives and impacts that are quite diversified. We presented these five statistics that the U.S. Remains as the main trading partner, but not for countries in South America where the main one is China or the EU, as the case may be. The importance of diversifying trade, but I'd like to clarify something important here. We are talking in relative terms. The recommendation we make is not to reduce or to substitute not to substitute exports to the US, is to add other destinations. It's about diversifying, is not stopping to do one thing and doing something else, but to do them all. It's an aggregation strategy. So to keep trying in absolute terms, hopefully to grow exports to the US, it's a key trading partner. We need to continue making that effort, but the idea is to diversify within a growing cake, so to speak, because that is what is actually convenient for the economic dynamism of a country and their productive development. And we have ended the time that we had allotted for this segment to cater to those questions from our colleagues. However, as usual, we've received more questions from more media that are interested in taking part in this conference. So please be sure, rest assured that very soon we'll respond those questions in writing as soon as possible. And in those commitments, I mean to the questions from Paulo Garcia, from Libre newspaper, Paulina Abramovich from France Press, Iber Saldaña from University of Mexico, Belén Eluecho from El Cronista Argentina, Byron Darden from 502 Guatemala, María Elisa Coronel from Argentina, and Leticia Hernandez from El Financiero, Mexico. We have received your questions. And as soon as possible, and with great pleasure, we're going to send the corresponding answers. I'd like to thank everyone in this conference, let you know that it is already available on our website, all materials associated to the presentations that we've received today, and of course also the public information unit of ECLAC is available to all of you to follow up any further question regarding the information that has just been delivered by the Executive Secretary of ECLAC and the team in charge of this report. Before closing this conference, Executive Secretary, any final remark or comment or final thought? First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for the interest. We know that something is being already published. If we think of the discussions about globalization until a few years ago, well, trade has always been a key pillar in that, but globalization was something that somehow the world had been developing in according to broad consensus since the post-war era in terms of having an investment and trade system based on rules in which countries, even though they may have been large powers, would voluntarily abide by those rules in order to avoid commercial wars, and smaller countries would actually respect because that's the best for small countries to be clear about the rules and to solve disputes. This was a specific effort coming up with this report because it discusses a very changing situation, very fluid situation in terms of tariffs and in terms of changes, the rules of the game, in terms of reconfiguration of the investment and trade flows. And we will continue discussing this. We have two reports about these topics. This one on trade and another one on foreign direct investment that are very much related. And we hope that this is going to be useful. There's lots of information on the news. These reports, well, our hope is, and we're sure that we're going to look at the trends and the outlook and to actually provide the correct perspective to some of this information, and especially helpful countries that we serve to have the best policies and the most cautious policies, but also with the highest returns for their employment, dynamism, private sector, SMEs, etc. So this is something fundamental, trade in terms of the economic growth and the well-being of the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you very much.
Gracias, secretario ejecutivo. Gracias a quienes nos han acompañado. Gracias sobre todo.
Thank you all. I'd like to thank the journalists because they are the bridge between us and the audience and the decision makers to provide these proposals and ECLAC's data, follow up our social networks. As the secretary said, there's going to be a new sequence of documents coming from ECLAC in the coming weeks and months. We hereby close this session. Thank you.